Seattle, known as the Emerald City, thriving and successful. But great things don't just happen. History makes us who we are. In Seattle, there have been many struggles that have helped it to grow, one of these being housing discrimination. Housing discrimination was both a conflict and compromise that changed history by creating the birth of several laws against racial discrimination all over Seattle, not just in the housing field. These laws and campaigns were a major part of the struggle for racial equality in Seattle. Buying a house wasn't easy if you're a minority back in the 1960s, especially in Seattle. According to the Merriam-Webster's dictionary, in this case, the minority group to feel the burden of discrimination the most was African Americans. The increasing population of African Americans in Seattle from 1940 to 1960 took many people by surprise. The city of Seattle was not a very diverse city before World War II, and the white people did not want anything to change. Some white people living in Seattle became biased about having African Americans around the city and discriminated against them by impounding them to the central area. The areas that the African Americans were forced to live in included Montlake, Madison Park, International District, and Beacon Hill. The conflict began when the African Americans started to notice the discrimination. When African Americans went to buy a house, the seller might raise the price to an impossible amount so they wouldn't buy it. In addition, they often found that banks and realtors had worked together to refuse to make loans to minorities wanting to purchase homes in certain parts of the city, creating the term redlining to describe the practice. According to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, the term redlining means other property owners rented to African Americans to find that other people living in the apartments would refuse to stay unless the landlord evicted the African Americans. Some neighborhoods even had specific rules against African Americans. For example, 935 properties and 38 blocks in Seattle had the same rule restricting African Americans. As these events and laws occurred more often, housing discrimination became more common. This left the African Americans with two choices: to live in central Seattle or Rainier Valley. Finally, the injustices brought the African Americans to a point where they were not willing to sit and take it any longer. Encouraged by the civil rights movement and several speeches, they decided to fight back. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words affected many people and helped change the way people in Seattle approached this subject. He once said, "The housing discrimination was making it nearly impossible to better their lives. To go to a good school, to be more educated, you had to own a home in that area." It was the year 1962 when they first showed the community that they wanted to receive the same respect and rights. Protests moved the compromise process along by bringing attention from many big organizations. The Seattleites' protests were nonviolent and relatively effective. They ranged from marches, meetings, rallies, protesting in public areas, and sit-ins. There were various organizations that helped the minorities stop the housing discrimination with peaceful protests. These organizations included the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, and the Equal Housing Opportunity. Local and national figures helped contribute to the compromise, working hard to encourage people to fight back. Together, the individuals and organizations worked on a variety of events, like the Freedom March of 1963. There were many people resisting the idea of a compromise. They tried to make sure they could retain the freedom to sell their house to anyone they wanted. However, anyone often meant white people only. Seattleites wrote numerous letters to the Seattle City Council urging them to support legislation against discrimination, but ultimately the vote fell in favor of those who wanted to continue the existing discriminatory policies. The minorities lost the first vote, but that did not stop them from protesting. Even though they were turned down several times, not only once, the minorities continued to fight, non-violently, for what they believed was right. Throughout 1964 to 1968, they worked tirelessly, protesting, writing letters, trying to convince others that housing discrimination was wrong, talking to important people, and trying to convince the government to end discrimination altogether. The Fair Housing Listing Service worked with 24 other organizations to equalize the different races and change the opposing people's opinions. The flurry of events and the combined efforts of organizations helped the passage of an open housing ordinance, a great accomplishment and reward to all the hard work that was put into ending housing discrimination. In 1968, 3 weeks after Dr. King was assassinated, the City Council passed Ordinance 96619. This was the ultimate compromise and victory for the minorities. Though this compromise was a long, enduring battle, the hard work, effort, and time that was put into ending housing discrimination in Seattle was completely worthwhile. The Fair Housing Act was one not to be forgotten. One right, one ordinance, led to a significant advancement of African American people and inspired them to continue fighting for their rights. Mayor Brahman signed a proclamation on Human Rights Day, December 4, 1968. In 1975,